Right, this is CV 2022-095-403. This is Lake versus Hobbs et al. Present for the record are the parties or their representatives and their respective counsel. I believe we're proceeding with the presentation of defendant's case. Your next witness would be?
Your Honor, our next witness is Ray Valenzuela.
Thank you.
Your Honor, as we get started, can we get a time check? I've got our calculation, but just want to know where we are.
Tell me what you've got, Mr.
I have 25 minutes remaining for plaintiffs, 2 hours, 24 minutes remaining for defendants combined.
Okay, so where does that stack up with your count?
Your Honor, we have 33 minutes remaining.
Okay.
And we don't want to.
How we're calculating objections.
We don't want to dispute whatever the court wants to do.
33 minutes is fine. Okay. Mr. Valenzuela, you'll step over here, sir. Raise your right hand to be sworn. Sir, you'll make your way around to my right to the witness stand, please, and have a seat. Please proceed as soon as you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Valenzuela. Can you please state your name for the record?
Reynaldo Valenzuela.
Can you describe your current employment, please?
I am the co-elections director of Maricopa County Elections Department, overseeing early voting and election services.
Did you have other positions with the Maricopa County Elections Department before you became the co-election director?
Approximately 6 years ago, I was the elections director before the department had gone through and rearranged, and I also worked as assistant director for early voting and other positions for the last 32 years with Maricopa County Elections.
In your role as co-elections director, what are your responsibilities, briefly?
Overseeing primarily the early voting process, all of its departments as far as special election boards, mail-out balloting, and so on, and also candidate filing and campaign filing.
Do you hold any professional certifications?
Yes, I'm a SARA certified election registration administrator through Election Center and Auburn University. Held that certification for 16 years and renew every 4 years. I'm also a certified election officer through the Arizona Secretary of State, and I've held that certification for 30 years, and it's renewed every 2 years.
Does Maricopa County's process for receiving and processing early ballot packets come within your responsibility?
It is under my purview.
And you may note that I just said early ballot packets. Can you explain why you call them packets and not ballots?
Absolutely. So in our department, the early voting department, that is our preferred term, because I know a lot of folks, as far as lay folks, would say that ballot was inserted in the drop box, that ballot. And in fact, it's not the ballot, it's the packet that has to undergo scrutiny, verification, and validation. So our department, the early voting department, calls them packets because that's exactly what they are until they undergo that verification process to become a ballot that could be tabulated.
So at the front end, how does a voter get an early ballot in the mail?
So there's multiple ways a voter can get. Obviously, they can get it request to get it by mail. They can get it early in person. They can also get it election day. And there is that process, again, by which the mail process is probably the predominant process that most get early ballot.
And when a voter receives a ballot by mail, how do you know that that's going to a registered voter?
Well, early voting is reliant on the voter registration. Voter registration is a vetted process where the registered voter is verified through multiple statewide database that says that we check it against motor vehicles, we check it against INS, we check it against SSN, vital statistics, all of those things to come back. Once that voter's put on the registration rolls, we verify their address through sending them a return service requested registration card. But why I mentioned that is because then that vetted voter is put and eligible for early ballot, which is then created utilizing that record and a specific unique piece ID that is created for every election for that particular voter for that early ballot packet.
And does that piece ID appear on the affidavit envelope in which a person would return an early ballot to the county?
It does.
And what are the different ways that the county gets early ballots from voters?
So
Ballot packets.
ballot packets, yes. So the ballot packet itself can be dropped off at one of our drop-off locations, whether it's a standalone drop box, which we have two, one here in Mesa, one in our McTech facility, can drop it off on election day or in person at any time during the early voting in-person period, or can return it by mail.
Before you ask the next question, I just noticed you speak quickly, Mr. Valenzuela. That may be a little bit difficult for the court reporter to follow. If you could just slow down slightly, sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Valenzuela, you just mentioned one of the ways that voters can return early ballot packets is by delivering them to vote centers or drop boxes. How do those ballots that have been delivered to a drop box or vote center during early voting, how does the county get those back to the central count facility?
So we do have a courier process by which we assign two individuals of bipartisan differing parties, a DEM and a REP is it specifically, and those individuals will visit the site, whether it be a standalone Dropbox, a city clerk that is assigned to be a Dropbox only, and or an early voting in-person site, and those couriers would present themselves. They would, those bipartisan couriers, to the clerk, city town clerk, or the inspector at the polling place or vote center, and that they would begin that process of emptying that sealed blue box that is present for collection of those ballots or packets.
Okay, and you said when you say emptying those boxes, that's emptying them at the site where the early voting site or at the drop box.
That is correct. So they would they have a process by which, and I can delineate it is as short as possible, but it is a secure process where they're filling out logs, a early voting ballot transfer receipt that is documenting seals, documenting the transfer of those into a secure cage that is sealed and brought back to our McTech facility.
Okay. And if we could bring up Exhibit 20. It seems like you may have anticipated my question. Is this document what you just described as the early voting transport statement?
It is.
And do these statements contain information about how many ballot packets the county received from the vote center or drop box?
It does, but it is a after receipt at McTech, but it does indeed have that in the transport receipt section.
So towards the bottom of that document.
Correct.
Where it says count of ballots in transport bin.
Correct.
At this time, Your Honor, I would move to admit Exhibit 20.
Objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
20 submitted.
So I think we've gotten to the point where early ballots come back to the central count facility at the county. Where do they go next?
So they go this top part of the receipt, and it actually very clear is at location, is where they are basically just transferring those packets into a secure bin, sealing that, come to our McTech facility. Then we have two representatives, auditor boards, that are, again, made up of differing parties, a DEM and a REP, that will take that and open that box and confirm and document on this bottom section, the transport receipt, all of the seals that were removed that were brought back from the original blue box, the new seals or the red box seals, and also the new seals we put on the box that we just left. It also will begin a process, because they're a smaller quantity. We do have a counting machine that we can run those packets through, and we will then process those and not shown here, but as an audit slip that we document how many of each packet we have received. There are three different types of packets: an in-person counter packet, which is a white envelope; a mail ballot, which an individual, we mailed it and they opted to deliver it, so it's a green envelope; and then we have voters that may have cast a provisional ballot. So there are 3 envelopes. They will take those bins, they will count those, they will document on there, count the ballots in transform bin, and they will ready them to then be commingled with several other boxes brought in and seal that for transport for an inbound scan process at Runbeck.
And just briefly, you mentioned the different colors of envelopes. On this form, next to the line where it says count of ballots, where it says 107G/31W, what does that mean?
That would be the 107 green affidavits, which would indicate mail ballots returned, and 31 white, which would mean in-person early voters that still, because there is no tabular there, still follow the envelope process or packet.
Okay. So you've also mentioned receiving ballots by mail. How does the county take possession of ballots that are mailed back?
So the county has with the United States Postal Service an arrangement that they do not deliver to us. We actually must physically be present at their main processing distribution center and have access list of individuals from our offices that would be eligible for that secure facility entry. And so we pick those up again with 2 individuals, a differing party, and they have those individuals' names on file, and they must show badges, and we collect those directly from the United States Postal Service.
And when the county employees pick up the ballots from the United States Postal Service, how are they packaged?
So like all mail that goes to that distribution, millions of pieces they go through, including mail packets, they are trayed and sleeved and caged. So when we come, there's a postal receipt that is an estimate of tray counts and totals within that tray. And so they are delivered to us at the dock in those cages, trayed and approximately 30 trays per cage. So we had 2 cages, we could have 60 trays with X amount of packets within them.
And what do the county employees, where do they go next with those ballots when they leave the United States Postal Service facility on 48th and Washington?
So those 2 couriers or pickup individuals will go straight to Runbeck with that particular day's mail, whether it's several trays or several cages, depending on the turnout on that given day. And we then check in and transfer that. We complete a delivery receipt with Runbeck and transfer those cages into their custody with our county protective services there on site, but they are taken to Runbeck and transfer custody with chain of custody documentation.
Okay, so at this point in the early ballot process, what services is Runbeck providing to the county when you drop those ballots off? Ballot packets.
So those packets themselves, they undergo what is called an inbound scan. And what that inbound scan's purpose is 3 things, is to 1, take an image of that packet so that we have an actual image to utilize for signature verification instead of farming those physical packets around for signature review. So image of the packet, number 1. 2, they do a count, an actual detailed count of those packets in that cage to report back. And 3, they're also identifying and validating that it is an actual packet that we created utilizing that piece ID, that unique piece ID tied to that voter that is specific to that election and created by us and in our system for the voter.
Thank you. Let me step back for a moment. Well, I think I needed to go 1 step back in the process to cover something else. Can you bring up Exhibit 82, please? Okay. So I think you mentioned that the ballots from the Postal Service come sleeved and trayed and in cages. Do you recognize this document that's up on the screen right now?
I do.
And can you tell us what that is?
It is, as I mentioned, the process is called inbound scan. This is our Maricopa County inbound receipt of delivery document that when we show up at Runbeck, that we are basically transferring that custody, but also it's the results of that scan or the results of that estimate. The example is showing here 84 trays at 600 per or 400 per tray, and so on. Then it tells you the quantity, the estimated quantity based on that receipt. In addition to, we may have regular MOBs, which is a mail-out ballot that we're bringing because we've adjudicated or we cured one, and so on. So for this particular day, we had one tray of 599 regular MOBs and one tray of 13 what we call need packets, and that's a disposition that, should we have reviewed it and we can't make a absolute final determination, we need the packet. Very simple. We're very creative, but just need the packet back so we can have the physical packet to do follow-up with the voter or on the packet itself.
So we've mentioned that there are estimates when you receive the ballots from the USPS. Do you get an exact count of the ballots, the USPS ballots that are delivered to Runbeck when they scan them?
Exactly. That is exactly the process, because there could be upwards of 10, hundreds of thousands that we can't count them at the dock. So we accept the tray count, the estimated weight count, as the post office provides to all vendors that pick up, and we then take it to that next detailed inbound scan count to get the exacting amount.
Let's briefly talk about signature verification. I don't want to get into the details of the process, but why does the recorder do signature verification of early ballot affidavit envelopes?
It is part of the process by which to prove identity. So obviously Arizona has a proof of identity. You go in person, you would provide photo ID. For a mail ballot, we don't request that you send your driver's license in, so that proof of identification is done through signature verification on a signature exemplars on file, vetted signature exemplars, registration form, multiple registration forms that you may have on file. Also, past signature rosters. If maybe you're not an early voter, but you voted in person, we have all of those signature rosters and signatures, in addition to past EV affidavit, vetted EV affidavit signatures. As an example, I myself, in showing this, when we train, I have close to 32 different exemplars from all the times I voted and or registration forms.
And just for the sake of clarity on the record, when you say EV affidavit, what does that mean?
The EV affidavit is the packet that we speak of. It is the packet has the attestation, and it has that I am who I am, and it has our unique piece ID printed and the voter's information.
And EV stands for
early voting.
And it's what the general public commonly knows as the envelope.
The green envelope if they get it by mail.
Does every early ballot that the county eventually tabulates go through the signature verification process?
100%. They cannot make it to the next phase. There's multiple bipartisan phases in between. They can't make it to the processing page made up of bipartisan boards who are auditing that tray report that says we've made these good, we've made these bad, we've made these need packet, whatever it may be, but the good six to get to tabulation must be signature verified.
And I have a piece of housekeeping. I think I did not ask to move the admission of Exhibit 82. Your Honor, I would at this time move admission of that exhibit.
No objection, Your Honor.
82 is admitted.
Has the county ever authorized Runbeck to allow its employees to deliver their own early ballot packets directly to Runbeck?
No.
And are you aware of Runbeck allowing its employees to do so in the past?
No.
Okay. I have no further questions for this witness. There may be some cross-examination.
Will that be, Mr.
Do you have anything to do?
I was asking you who it would be.
Oh.
You've answered my question. Mr. Blem.
Sir, Your Honor. Mr. Valenzuela, isn't it true that no Maricopa County employees operate Runbeck equipment?
No, correct.
Okay. So isn't it true then that you farm out the counting of ballots to Runbeck on election day?
We do not.
You
They
do
do
not.
not count ballots. They count packets.
I think you just said you accept the mail, the U.S. Postal Service's weight receipt?
We don't utilize that for a final count.
You rely on Runbeck to run these through their machine and give you a count, isn't that correct?
That is correct, of the packets.
Okay. And the county does not run or operate Runbeck?
It is a certified vendor that we have contract with.
And Exhibit 80, that's just an inbound receipt of estimates, is that correct?
I'm sorry, you turned
The inbound receipt of estimates, that's just an estimate, correct?
for the
Exhibit 80?
USPS packets.
Who created Exhibit 80?
Hold on.
Objection. I think Mr. Blum is citing the wrong exhibit number.
Oh, I'm sorry. The inbound receipt, the last one that was received. The
It's
inbound
82.
receipt,
82.
82. Who created that document?
The format of the document,
Who made the document? Who signs the document?
well, signs the document, it's shared between
Shared.
Runbeck and a county employee, the Kari.
So it shows, does it not, that you are turning over ballots to Runbeck, correct?
We're turning packets over.
Packets. You have no idea exactly how many you're turning over, correct?
We have an estimate, but we rely on that count, that certified vendor to do that. kind of
Why do we use chain of custody documents that show the details of how many ballots we have?
Objection.
When you count ballots, you put them on a chain of custody form, correct?
Wait a second.
EBBPS process?
Objection. He's calling for speculation, lack of foundation.
Speculation.
Hold on, wait, let me rule.
Let's get ask a different question, Your Honor, because I'm.
Okay, withdrawn?
EVBTS documents that you testified about and we just admitted into evidence. Those contain counts, do they not?
They do.
Of the number of ballots that were brought back. Why
Some-
do we do that?
the number of ballots that are delivered and then the number of estimated in some cases.
Why do we do that?
Why do we provide that?
Yes.
So that we have a basis to reconcile to some degree.
Okay. Isn't it so that we know exactly how many ballots were injected into the system at each point in the process?
It is not, because
It
we
is
don't
not.
have that at the post office level.
As you sat here, you just testified.
Hold on, wait a
Mr.
second.
Val-
Just a second. Let him finish answering. We only have one person speaking at a time, please. Okay? For the sake of my court reporter, okay, the record will look, if you've ever read a transcript, it has a bunch of dashes when people talk over themselves or each other. So please. And slowly.
Mr. Valenzuela, you had absolutely no idea that Runbeck employees were allowed to inject ballots into the system, isn't that correct?
I did not.
You had no idea. And isn't it true that you had no idea because you do not keep adequate documentation with regards to the number of ballots you receive on election day and give to Runbeck? Yes or no? It's a simple question.
Objection, Your Honor.
Objection to what?
Foundation, Mr. Valenzuela has not testified to regarding election day.
If he's able to answer the question, I'm going to let him answer. If he doesn't understand it, I'll have Mr. Blum rephrase it. So
Are you
if you can answer the question, sir, do so. If you cannot, tell us.
Repeat, if you will.
You have no idea how many election day ballots are transported to Runbeck because you do not document exactly how many ballots are transported to Runbeck. Isn't that correct?
For the United States Postal Service pickup, we do not receive a finite number, so we do not know that number when we deliver to Runbeck.
Drop box ballots. Does the same apply?
Does not. We do know that because it is a small quantity where we have a counter that we can count 100 ballots, 1,000 ballots, but not 290 through this counter.
You know the exact number?
Exact number of.
Ballots, ballot packets, drop box ballot packets.
We do, part of our audit review is we do count the drop box ballot packets because they are outside of the purview, whereas a federal post office, they don't leave chain of custody from the federal post office once we pick them up, but the ballot boxes, we do make that count.
On election day.
On election day, no.
Huh.
Because we're not doing drop box courier process at that time. It's a different process for election day.
Thank you, Ron. Oh, hold on. Would you by chance happen to know how many exact ballots were door 3 ballots? Was it 17,000?
I wouldn't speak exactly to it. That would be under the purview. of
Do you know how many thousands of duplicated ballots there were?
I don't have that number to speak definitively.
You know how many spoiled ballots there were?
I do not.
Okay. Do you know how many ballots were rejected and not put in door 3, spoiled, duplicated, or otherwise?
I have an estimate, but that's not under my purview as early voter.
What's your estimate?
For the,
Okay, here's my question again very quickly, Mr. Valenzuela. How many ballots rejected and not put in door 3, spoiled, or duplicated?
that I don't. I just know of the 17,000 number, which is a total of unread, but not broken down.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Said I wasn't going to say that. Mr. Valenzuela, are election day operations and tabulation under your responsibility?
They are not.
And whose responsibility is over those two items?
My co-director of elections, Mr. Scott Jarrett.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Okay. May the witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Valenzuela. You're excused, sir. County's next witness, please.
Your Honor, we call Scott Jarrett.
Go ahead and take the stand.
Your Honor.
Mr. Jarrett, you remain under oath from your previous appearance. Do you understand it, sir?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Jarrett. Could you please state your name?
Yep, Robert Scott Jarrett.
And where do you currently work, Mr. Jarrett?
I work for the Maricopa County Elections Department.
What is your current position?
So I am the co-director of the Elections Department. I oversee in-person voting and tabulation operations.
How long have you held this position?
I was appointed by the Board of Supervisors in 2019.
And could you just briefly describe your job duties in that position?
Yes, so I oversee all in-person voting operations. So that includes early in-person voting that I report up to the Maricopa County Recorder for. That does include drop boxes. I also then oversee in-person voting on Election Day, as well as, so that would be all the recruiting and training of poll workers, recruiting of temporary staff that work at McTech, or the Maricopa County Elections and Tabulation Center. And then I would also oversee warehouse operations, then all tabulation functions, including at the central count facility as well as at the voting locations.
Thank you. And what's your educational background?
So I have a bachelor's degree in accounting from the Arizona State University.
And what did you do before you were the co-elections director?
So I was an internal auditor with Maricopa County, and then also had some time with the Maricopa County Community College District, auditing performance, auditing risk management, risk mitigation, as well as compliance audits.
So we're just going to generally discuss how elections are conducted in Maricopa County on Election Day. To start, what was the total voter turnout in Maricopa County for the 2022 general election?
So voter turnout was 64%, or 1,562,000 voters, or approximately there.
Okay, and how did that compare to previous midterm elections?
So it was one of the higher percentages. If you go back for several decades, all the way back to the 70s, it was actually the second highest as far as voter turnout. 2018 only exceeded it by a small percentage. And then even more recently, the average of the three midterm elections was about 54%. So that'd be 2018, 2014, and then 2010. So turnout in 2022 was about 10 percentage points higher.
So we've talked about vote centers. Just briefly explain how the vote center model works.
Yes, so a vote center model works is it allows a voter to vote at any location that Maricopa County is offering. We offered 223 vote centers in the 2022 November general election. That was an increase over the August primary, which we had 210. And it was also an increase over 2020, which we had 175 vote centers. So we're able to offer that option through our Sitebook check-in station. So that will confirm if a voter is registered, confirm that they've not voted previously, and then it will allow us, in conjunction with our ballot on demand technology, our printers, to print that specific ballot for that voter. Maricopa County, we have over 12,000 different ballot styles, so we cannot offer a vote center model without that ballot on demand technology.
So, thank you. How does the elections department, well, actually, what's the average distance between vote centers? What was the average distance in the 2022 general?
So we performed that calculation actually based off the August primary, where we had 210 vote centers, and that average distance was just under 2 miles per vote center, 1.98. We did add then those 13 additional vote centers for the general election. So that actually distance would be smaller, but I don't have that specific calculation.
So on election day, when people are voting, and at times waiting in line to vote at certain vote centers, how does the elections department communicate with the public about the wait times that are at the various vote centers?
So when we're tracking this information through our site books, our poll workers are going and gathering the number of voters in line, and they will go count all the way to the end of those lines. They report that back to us through that site book. Then we post that information onto our website that is updated about every 15 minutes from every one of our voting locations. So voters will know when they're attempting or driving to a voting location, what is that wait time at that location. We advertise that through, so we had many different press conferences leading up to the election, informing voters to use that website. All in-person voters are also provided a sample ballot. And on that sample ballot, it directs voters to, it does provide their closest location, but also that they could go to the locations.maricopa.vote website to identify what are all their voting options and in-person voting locations.
So based on Maricopa County's calculations, well, let's start with you. You heard Dr. Mayer's testimony earlier today regarding his analysis of wait times. Is that right?
That's correct.
And did you agree with his description of the way that Maricopa County makes that calculation?
So we make our calculation based off of how many voters are in line and how quickly they're able to check in to those voting locations. So that is how long it's taking them from the end of the line to be able to check in to then receive their ballot. And that's based off historical knowledge as well as the throughput, how many voters are getting through and checking in on a site book.
And I think you heard, or I recall Dr. Mayer testifying about people's perceptions sometimes being incorrect about the length of time. What are some of the things that you've observed or experienced impacting that perception or misperception, perhaps?
Yeah, I think when someone's making an estimate about how long they've waited in line, they may be making that off of when they arrived, they parked at the voting location, right? Whether they've then stood in line, right, to be checked in at the voting location, how long it took them to get their ballot, but also then how long it would take them to actually vote their ballot. And that can vary greatly, right? So some voters, we had in Maricopa County, one of the longest ballots ever, on average, over 85 contests. So some voters come in very, very prepared, right? They may even bring a sample ballot with them, and that can help them expedite and fill out that ballot much more quickly. Some voters may come in and they'll see the contest and they only want to vote a few. So that might only take them a minute or fewer to even complete that ballot. But then some voters, and this is within, we allow this. We encourage voters to be able to do this. We want them to be informed. So they will go get a publicity pamphlet, and they may investigate and read all the different information about each individual contest, and then make their decisions in that voting booth. For example, one day in early voting, we had a voter show up. Our voting location closed at 5. They showed up at about shortly before 4 p.m. And that voter didn't end up leaving the voting booth until close to 7 p.m. So they did not wait in any line to check in. They did not wait in any line to get their ballot printed out of that on-demand printer, but they spent several hours in the voting booth completing their ballot, then to put that into an affidavit envelope to be returned to the elections department. So when the voters calculate the time that they spent voting, it's all based on some of their choices, their own choices that they make, and how long they're going to complete their ballot, or whether they're going to put their ballot into a tabulator or drop it into door number 3, a secure ballot box.
So based on the county's analysis, what were the longest wait times on election day?
So we had at about 16 locations, wait times approaching about 2 hours, or between 90 minutes and 2 hours. And that was not for the entire day. That was intermittent. Some of those were towards the end of the day. But in every one of those instances, we had locations that were close by for a voter to be able to choose a different option to be able to drive to. In some of those cases, it was less than 1 minute wait times.
And just to reiterate earlier, that's all communicated and publicly available to the public on the county's websites.
That's correct. They could sort on our website, not only by entering in their address, they can sort by wait times as well. And we had more than 85% of our voting locations on election day never had a wait time in excess of 45 minutes. And it was, I believe it was over 160 locations never had a wait time over 30 minutes.
So this information that you just provided, was this part of the analysis that was provided in the report to the Attorney General that was discussed yesterday?
Yes, that's correct. So I drafted that report. It was based off of all the information that we had, the data that we had in the Maricopa County Elections Department. So every aspect of that. And with regarding to wait times, it's based off that very systematic approach of how we train voters, or how we train our poll workers to enter that data based on the number of voters in line.
So is it your belief that the information in that report was accurate and correct?
That's correct. I believe that it was accurate, and what I communicated to the Attorney General through that report was done with integrity and was accurate.
Okay, so let's move on to actually election day. And you talked about the ballot on demand printers, and you discussed that more than 12,000 ballot styles Maricopa County has, and that's why those ballot on demand printers are required, right?
That's correct.
Okay. On election day in 2022, were there issues with some of the county's ballot on demand printers?
Yes, there were some issues with some of our printers.
And can you describe what those issues were?
So we are in the middle of our root cause analysis still on this, but we have identified a few items that contributed to the printer issues. The first was our, and what we would have our smaller printer, so the Oki printer. And that was, it was not printing ballot timing marks on the back of the timing mark dark enough, or some of them were speckled. And that was due to what we identified was the printer settings, or the heat settings on a fuser. And we needed to adjust those printer settings to all be consistent at the highest heat setting. Now, we had used these heat settings for prior elections in 2020, as well as the August 2022 primary, the exact same heat settings. We had gone through stress testing and identified that this was not an issue, or was not identified through that testing. But on election day, we identified that due to the variance and the number of ballots being printed through, along with the affidavit envelope, as well as the control slip, we needed to change those heat settings to be consistent for all 3 types of items being printed from those printers to be at the highest heat setting, or the heavy heat setting. A few of the other items that we've identified, though, as far as our ballot on demand printers, we did identify 3 different locations that had a fit to paper setting that was adjusted on election day. So those were at our Journey Church in a North Glendale, Peoria area. That had about 200 or a little over 200 ballots had that setting on it out of about 1,500 ballots voted at that voting location. That'd be the same with our Gateway Fellowship Church, which is in a East Mesa voting location. That had about 900 ballots out of just shy of 2,000 ballots voted at that voting location. And then we had a LDS Church, Lakeshore, in the heart of Tempe, that had about 60 ballots out of 1,500. So just shy of 1,300 ballots. And that was due to our temporary technicians, when they were trying to identify solutions on election day, adjusting a setting. Now, this was not direction that we provided from the Maricopa County Elections Department, but adjusting that setting to a fit to paper setting. And that was one of the vote centers that was reviewed in the inspection by the plaintiffs in this trial on Monday.
So that,
Or was that Tuesday? I forget the day. I've been working
Tuesday, I think.
every day
Oh,
through the weekend.
right. So if I'm understanding you, on election day, when there was troubleshooting trying to identify this ballot on demand printer issue, one of the T-Techs or some of the T-Techs adjusted that setting, and that impacted some of the ballots that were cast at those 3 locations. Is that right?
That's correct. And that was not a 19-inch ballot, right? That when that happens, it's a 20-inch ballot, a definition of a 20-inch ballot that's loaded on the laptop that is connected to the ballot on demand printer that gets printed onto then a 20-inch piece of paper. But because of the fit to paper setting, it actually shrinks the size of that ballot. And then that ballot would not be tabulated on site at the voting location, and also could not be tabulated on site at central count.
So if it couldn't be tabulated at the voting location and at central count through the regular tabulators, what happened to those ballots?
So those ballots came back to the central count facility, and then we had hired duplication boards, a bipartisan team, Republicans and Democrats, to duplicate that ballot. So they first affix a marrying number to that ballot. So that would then be able to identify that ballot back to then the ballot that gets duplicated on site at the elections department. So we can marry those 2 up, and all the votes get transferred to the duplicated ballot that gets counted and tabulated.
So ultimately, all of those ballots were tabulated.
That's correct.
So just to sort of close the loop on this, there were heat settings that have been identified so far in your investigation. There were the T-Techs who had changed to the fit to page setting, and that impacted some of the ballots that were printed on election day. Were there any other issues that you've discovered at this point that impacted the ability for some tabulators at vote centers to be able to read ballots that were cast on election day?
Yeah, so there's a few other instances that we've identified. One is the use of a very thin writing utensil, such as a ballpoint pen, and then voters using check marks or X's. And that is because our precinct-based tabulators, or our vote center tabulators that are on site, they cannot read an ambiguous mark, right? So if a voter has an ambiguous mark on their ballot, the tabulator alerts the voter there is an ambiguous mark, right? And then that voter was given the option to either spoil that ballot and vote a new ballot, or to put that ballot into the secure door number 3, the drop box. So then that can be then returned to the elections department and duplicated. So we did identify about 10% of those door number 3 ballots were the cause of having an ambiguous mark on the ballot. We also did identify in our door number 3 as well some early ballots that were inserted into that. So that is an indication that a voter took their early ballot out of the affidavit envelope, attempted to insert those into the vote center tabulator, which is not unusual. That happens every election. We also identified a few provisional ballots as well. So that's when a voter would be issued a provisional ballot on site. They take it out of the envelope and then attempt to insert that into the tabulator as well. So our poll workers are trained not to look at the voter's ballot. see how that they voted. But they work with the voter to identify, okay, this ballot's not reading. And then if they were issued a provisional, ask them, where's your affidavit envelope? You need to insert that into the affidavit envelope. But at that point in time, it becomes the voter's choice. Do they want to insert it back into the affidavit envelope? Do they want to drop it into door number 3?
And to be clear, can the on-site, I think you've testified to this, but just to be clear, can the on-site tabulators read early ballots?
They cannot read early ballots or provisional ballots. They're specifically programmed not to read those ballots as a control measure to prevent double voting.
So we've talked now about the issue that arose. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the timing of when you learned that this was happening and in the process that the county took to try and identify a resolution that you said was identified. At about what point in the day did you learn that there were some issues with tabulation?
We received our first call from our first vote centers are starting about 6:20 to 6:30. And at that point in time, we once we started receiving those calls, we alerted the poll workers to follow their training, which was to and a couple options. One was to have those voters and give them the option to drop their ballot into that secure door number 3, our drop box, a practice that we've used in Maricopa County since the 90s, right? Ever since we first introduced on-site tabulators at those voting locations. Again, voters being able to put their ballots in that secure drop box there's 15 counties in Maricopa County, 8 of them. So, and if you go to the 5 largest counties in Arizona, Pima County, slightly Democratic leaning. You look at Pinal County, the 3rd largest, slightly Republican leaning. You look at Yavapai County, again, slightly Republican leaning, and Mojave County. All of those don't offer on-site tabulation. They only offer a secure ballot drop box. So we alerted our voters to be able to, or our poll workers, remind voters that they had that option to drop off their ballot in that secure ballot drop box. We also reminded them that they can have those voters spoil that ballot, check in again, get a new ballot. And then we also had implemented a cleaning procedure for this election for our troubleshooters. And so we had some of our troubleshooters start cleaning those precinct-based tabulators. So that was right away at about that 6:20 to 6:30 point. We also deployed T-techs, or technicians, out into the field. We had over 90 of them deployed on election day, and they started investigating and troubleshooting the issue. So that took us about a couple hours to rule out that it was not a tabulator issue. So at that point in time, those first couple hours, was it a tabulator issue? Was it a printer issue? We started getting reports back by about 8:30 that it was the timing marks on the ballots themselves, that they were not printed dark enough. So at that point in time, we need to determine why that was, because all of our stress testing at that point in time had never identified this as being an issue. So once we went through and were investigating that, we were working with our print vendor. They had members out in the field deployed as well. We also had members from our tabulation company out in the field investigating as well. So by about 10:15, we identified the solution, or a potential solution, and that was to change those heat settings. At that point in time, we needed to replicate it. So then it took us about another hour at several different sites to replicate that would be the solution on election day. Once we had identified that solution, between then, I think it was around 11:30, all the way through 7 p.m., which that's the time that's referenced in the Attorney General's report, the 7 p.m. timeline, we were making and going out and changing those heat settings on those tabulators.
So just to take a step back, some of the vote centers at Maricopa County are also early voting locations. Is that right?
That's correct. We use a phased in opening approach for our vote centers.
So why is it that this issue with the ballot on demand printers wouldn't have been discovered through the early voting process?
Well, because we didn't have any on-site tabulators at any of our early voting locations. So all of the timing marks that were printed, so the lighter timing marks, all of those were able to actually be read through our central count tabulation equipment. So during early voting, a voter puts in their ballot into an affidavit envelope and brings it back to central count. Those get then run through our central count tabulation equipment. So those were running fine. We had no issues. So only the ones actually that weren't running through our central count or our tabulator were the ones that were the fit to page setting for those printers. And none of those were occurring during early voting as well.
So, Mr. Jarrett, do you have any reason to believe that the issues that occurred on election day with some ballot on demand printers was caused by intentional misconduct?
I have no knowledge or no reason to believe that.
Okay, we're going to switch gears a little and talk about chain of custody documents. So you heard Mr. Valenzuela talking about the early ballot transport statements. You're familiar with those documents, correct?
That's correct, because I oversee the in-person voting operations.
And what are, just to reiterate, what are those documents used for?
So those are used by our bipartisan courier teams to go out to vote centers and drop boxes used during early voting, the early voting period, all the way up until the day before election day, to retrieve early ballots that are in that affidavit envelope, and to document how they're transferred from those vote centers back to the central count tabulation center. So documents all the tamper evidence seals, who those individuals were, as well as once they get back to the central count facility, the count of the number of early ballots that were transported.
So then that gets us to the day before election day, right? Let's talk about election day and the chain of custody documents that are used on election day. Could we flip plaintiff's exhibit 85, please? So I believe, Your Honor, that this has already been admitted into evidence.
I believe you're correct. Right? Yes. 82.
Okay. Well, so thank you. I'll take a minute to establish the foundation for this document. Mr. Jarrett, do you recognize this document?
Yes, this is an example of one of our precinct ballot reports that are completed. Well, first, the seal numbers that are here are actually during our logic and accuracy test. When we're scanning those in, those seal numbers are for the tabulators that are on site at every voting location. So some of this information is populated by the elections department to occurring on election day.
Mm-hmm.
We deliver all of these precinct ballot reports to our inspectors. So those are the supervisors at every voting location. And then the inspectors, along with their fellow poll workers, will complete these documents on site at the voting location. Some of those tasks are done during the opening procedures. Some of those tasks are done during the closing procedures.
So let's walk through section by section what's on here. So you talked that the purpose of this is for the inspectors and some of the poll workers on election day to document what's occurred at that location. So what is the first section that's identified as opening polls? What information is provided in that section?
Well, so I will say there is a name of the facility that was just higher up on the voting location. So each one of our facilities has this report that identifies the location in the facility. The next section talks about the tabulators and our accessible voting device. So this is to document that each door or port on that tabulator has a seal number affixed, right? Those seals were affixed by the elections department employees prior to or during the logic and accuracy test. And those are what the poll workers used to verify that those tabulators had not been tampered with between the time that the elections department affixed those seals and when the poll workers are opening up the voting location and opening the polls on election day. We also have information related to the accessible voting device. We have a lifetime counter that is being added to the right there, beginning lifetime counter under the accessible voting device. And then if there were any beginning total ballots printed, the accessible voting device is not widely used at all of our different voting locations. So it's not unusual for there not to have a ballot count on that next line, the beginning total ballots printed.
And I think you said that the inspectors and the poll workers are completing these documents. What, just briefly, kind of training do the inspectors get prior to having that role at the vote centers on election day?
So we go into in-depth, in-person training on this form for all of our poll workers on how to complete this, not only our inspectors, but it's covered through a PowerPoint presentation that goes through what are their responsibilities. We also provide a training manual that details exactly how this form should be completed. And then there's different checklists within our training manual for assignments on what the different poll workers and the roles that the poll workers play in completing this form.
So there's 2 tabulators at every location, correct?
That's correct.
So they're
Oh, we
filling-
had 2 tabulators at every location except for one, which is our Gawker Village location, which is actually, to get there, we have to go through Pinal County, and it serves the Tohono O'odham Nation.
So
Every other vote center had 2 tabulators.
thank you. So if we could scroll down a little further on the document. So let's talk about the closing polls section in the middle. What information is provided in that section, and when is that? Well, let's start with what information is provided.
So at the end of the night, after the polls have closed, all voters have finished voting and left the voting location. The poll workers start their closing operations, and then they start getting and compiling some information. Some of that information comes from the tabulators themselves. So that's what we see the ballot count on tabulator screen. So there's the 2 different tabulators. So then they'll log how many ballots were counted on each tabulator. They'll then check off as they're performing some specific tasks, whether they've removed the memory cards. So those memory cards are what are going to be read in on election night to report results. So they're going to be removing those. They're going to be taking off a tamper evidence seal. They're actually going to be affixing that tamper evidence seal to the back of this form. And then they're going to then take those memory cards, put them into what we call a bubble pack. That's going to be in a container so that those memory cards can be securely and safely transported back from the voting locations. After both memory cards from the 2 different tabulators on site are in those bubble packs, those are then affixed with a tamper evidence seal as well, which is logged here.
And that, I believe, is the second or the next page of this exhibit, the under seals. Is that what you're describing?
That's correct. So they take the actual seal itself and then they'll fix it to the back of the form.
So let's then move down to the bottom section. It says security seals. What information is being provided in that section?
So here is where we're documenting the chain of custody of items being returned back from the voting location. So if they have a black bag, so those black canvas bags, those are what the poll workers use to return the voted ballots. So those live loose ballots that are not in an affidavit envelope. So they'll put those in a black canvas bag, then they'll affix a tamper evidence seal to those bags, and they'll log that information here. Now, every voting location has 2 black bags that we issue to it, but sometimes the voters only use one of the precinct-based tabulators, so they only take out the ballots from one of those locations, put it into that black canvas bag, so there'll only be 1 seal that's logged. They're logging here. The other information here is a red box or a red box seal. So those are the forms that are being returned to us from the voting location. So it's a secure container that has a closing lid, and then they'll be able to fix tamper evidence seals to those and then log that information here on this form. And then those blue box seals, those are the transport containers that we're delivering the early ballots that are in those affidavit envelopes back to the elections department. So it's very clear, they're not loose ballots at that point in time. They're in a sealed green affidavit envelope with a unique piece ID on that affidavit envelope. Those go into these blue bins and they get logged. The seals on those get logged onto this form. And this is what documents the secure transport from the voting location from the poll workers to the elections department.
So before we talk about how all of this information and all of these items make their way back to MCTAC, Scott, in your position, are you familiar with the elections procedures manual?
Yes, yes, I am.
And in talking about this section on the blue box seals and the process that you just described for putting those green affidavit envelopes that were collected on election day into those boxes and sealing them, is that consistent with the requirements of the elections procedures manual?
Yes, it is. Chapter 9, subsection 8, subpart B, I believe it's on page 192. It describes that at the end that's closing procedures for our elections boards at our voting locations. So it provides for them to be able to put those early ballot affidavit envelopes with the ballots sealed inside into a secured container. Does not require that we count those at the voting location. It just requires that we put those into a secure container, affix that with tamper evident seals, and return it back to the elections department.
Your Honor, before we move to that, I would like to move Plaintiff's Exhibit 85 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, 85 submitted.
Are you able to pull up Exhibit 60? And if we can go to page 192, Mr. Jarrett just referenced. So, Mr. Jarrett, is this the section that you were referring to?
That's correct. That's subpart B, election board closeout duties. And if you go, so you can see that on the left, page 192, on the right, page 193, it's actually that bullet G, the number of early ballots received by the voting location. So it asked that we document that on what we call our precinct ballot report, unless the ballots are transported in a secure sealed transport container to the central county place.
And that's the practice of Maricopa County.
That's correct.
So once the form is completed, what happens next with the items that are documented on there and the forms?
So those secure containers will then be transported one of two ways. One will be by the poll workers directly to McTech, our central counting facility, if it's one of the locations that's close by the central counting facility. So most of those are within central Phoenix. If it is a more remote location, then we set up a receiving site that has sheriff deputies on site. We have bipartisan teams. We have truck drivers at those voting locations. So, and then those would be receiving sites where the poll workers then will deliver all the items, including the ballots, those loose ballots that are in a black canvas bag that are sealed, the memory cards, the red transport containers, and the blue transport containers. Once those arrive on site, we have bipartisan teams filling out chain of custody documents, receiving all of those items, so documenting them coming into that receiving site. We're also then, for the first time now, scanning those items. So all those tamper evident seals have a little barcode that can be scanned. So we're scanning all of those items as they're coming in from the voting location to the receiving site. They get loaded up. So all of the different receiving sites that are close by. So if we have one like at Surprise City Hall, all the voting locations that are close by Surprise City Hall, drive there, deliver their items. Those will then be escorted from two different patrol deputies from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, those trucks, all the way back to McTech. Once they arrive back at McTech, we're then scanning in all of those seals again, documenting that transfer of chain of custody from the truck drivers to McTech. Then once all of those seals are scanned, then for those early ballots that are in those blue transport containers, we send them through our bipartisan teams, which we call our blue line. So that's where those seals will finally be broken once they get to the elections department. And then we will begin sorting them. So what will be in there are green affidavit envelopes. So those would be any of the early ballot drop-offs. There could be some of those white envelopes, those counter ballots that were still there from the night before, so on that Monday, during emergency voting, if voters had participated, or there could be provisional ballots in all of those. So that blue line team is now sorting those into different mail trays by ballot type. So, and then those will then be going into secure cages. So, and in those secure cages, we're able to estimate and provide an estimate of the number of ballots that are in each of those trays, as well as those secure cages. We then have a bipartisan team then in a truck deliver those to Runbeck on election night. We also employ a 2-member team at Runbeck. So when we are delivering that first ballot, those early ballots, again, in a green affidavit envelope, there's a team on site at Runbeck. One of them is a permanent employee. That permanent employee has a county issued cell phone, so they can take pictures of forms that are being scanned through and counts and numbers, documenting the exact numbers that are being scanned in by Runbeck. We also had a temporary staff member that was appointed by the county chairman for the Republican Party that was also on site during this whole process. Those members are signing those inbound scan receipt forms. So as they're going through and being counted by those high capacity scanners, counting those green affidavit envelopes on election night, all the way through till the next day, which was not completed until actually 5 p.m. or just shortly after 5 p.m. They were scanning each one of those, and they'd be able to scan them by ballot type. So here's the number of green affidavits that were in spec, right? So some of them are underweight. So we're even documenting how many of those ballots were underweight, how many of those ballots were overweight, how many of those ballots actually didn't have a valid ID number. Those are a voter returning to us in a green affidavit envelope their maybe primary ballot or their 2020 ballot. So, and we're documenting all of those. So once they're scanned in, we have a 1-for-1 tracking for every one of those affidavit envelopes, but we also have a total count. And we had a total count of 291,890 early ballots scanned in, and the elections department with our vendor, best-in-class vendor, Runbeck, certified vendor, was performing those counts under the direct supervision and observation of Maricopa County employees. And we signed every single one of those inbound scan forms as they were coming in. They documented the start time of the scan, they documented the end time of the scan. That's how we maintain chain of custody for every one of those early ballots all the way through the process until we transferred it over to Runbeck. And then we had a 1-for-1, that piece ID on every affidavit envelope. So we would know if a ballot was inserted or rejected or lost in any one part of that process, we would know it.
Thank you, Scott. So I just want to be clear on the numbers. So these 291,890 are the number of early ballot packets that came in on election night. Is that right?
That's correct.
So in earlier, Mr. Valenzuela talked about the need to use the high-speed scanners at Runbeck to be able to process a number that high. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's why we had a team, right, following that chain of custody all the way through the process until we got to Runbeck. And then even at Runbeck, we had teams hired by Maricopa County to maintain that custody until it was transferred and we had an actual count of those ballots.
Okay. So could we pull up Defendant's Exhibit 33, please?
That's completed. And then you can see, and not in the best image quality, but you can see right under where you can see the grid or the boxes, there's some staff member signatures that are being signed right there. And those are the Maricopa County employees.
Thank you. Sorry, just a little housekeeping, Your Honor. Did we admit Exhibit 85? The plaintiff's Exhibit 85, I believe.
Today? Okay,
Just then.
today, then yes, it was.
Yep. That's okay. Okay, sorry, Scott. So, I'm sorry. So we started, these are the ones that are used on election night, I believe you just said.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's talk about the information that's documented on here, starting at the top.
So it will be identifying the date and the operator at Runbeck that's running their equipment, right? And then we have an election number that's assigned for every election. So that's documented at the very top of this. The next items are going to be the batch ID that's assigned by Runbeck. That's being scanned through their inbound scan equipment. And then the next pieces of information start counting the number of green affidavit envelopes that are being scanned in through their equipment. So the inbound scan here, it's showing there's 9,940 inbound scanned green affidavit envelopes. Also then we'll show the number of provisionals. And here I can't read it on this equipment because of the image quality. It will also show the number of early ballot affidavit envelopes that are overweight. So that could be that the voter kept the instructions in that green affidavit envelope. It'll show then the number of green affidavit envelopes that are underweight. So maybe that's an empty affidavit envelope, or maybe the ballot's damaged inside and it's not a complete ballot. It also show then the number of ballots that didn't have or had an invalid ID. So those are potentially the green affidavit envelopes that are from the primary election, right? Or then if it's unreadable. So there are some times where there's a damaged green affidavit envelope, or that affidavit envelope can't be read. So we're taking that image, then those will go through special handling, turned over to the recorder's office and the early voting team to document that transfer of custody.
And I think you testified before that at all times of this process, from when these are taken out of the blue bins, placed into the trays, into the cages, transported to Runback, that is all done under the observation of Maricopa County permanent employees. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so if you look at this document, again, it's hard to see it on here, but where do you see that the county employees have signed off and verified the information on here?
So it's those signatures just below that grid, and you can see two different signatures. One of those is one of our permanent employees, and one of those was then that temporary employees. And by the way, it was a Democrat and a Republican there, so that we had that bipartisan representation as well. And then our permanent employee with their county issue cell phone, after each one of these were scanned in, they would take a picture of that, and then they sent that via email to me, Mr. Valenzuela, and a few of the other election directors, our assistant election directors within. So we had then an accounting for these via image as well.
And just to be clear, the temporary employee that you referred to was appointed by
The county Republican chair for the Maricopa County Republican Party.
Okay, thank you. And then once this process is completed, then these go, am I correct that these go through then the signature verification process like Mr. Valenzuela described in his testimony? Is that right?
That's correct. So these ballots would then be secured and stored in a vault, right? Under them, we have a security guard on site, a Maricopa County employee, security guard on site for 24 hours a day. And then once they are completed the signature verification process, then they won't be transferred back to the county until that's completed. And all of those are documented through those forms that Mr. Valenzuela went through.
Thank you. Your Honor, I'd like to move Defendant's Exhibit 33 into evidence, please.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
33 is admitted.
All right, one last point, Scott. I during the course of this process, we've heard discussion of the 275,000 plus estimate that was made after voting was completed on Election Day. Can you explain how that number, how that estimate gets made on Election night?
So those were based off all those green affidavit envelopes coming back through those blue transport bins that we broke the tamper evidence seals on, and then taking those out and organizing them into those mail trays. So at that point, it's just an estimate. And so then Mr. Recorder, Richard, he made an estimate early in the day following election day on 11/9, the day after. We had not finished our scanning in process. That wasn't completed till much later in the evening, just shortly after 5 p.m., when we had that full accounting for all those 290,000 early ballots. So that estimate was released earlier in the day to just give an indication of there was going to be 275,000 plus early ballots that still needed to be counted.
Thank you, Scott. One moment. All right, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Jarrett, do you recall your testimony yesterday?
Yes, I do.
And yesterday you testified that a 19-inch ballot image being imprinted on a 20-inch ballot did not happen in the 2022 general election. Did you recall that?
Yes, I recall that there was not a 19 ballot definition in the 2022 general election.
But that wasn't my question, sir. I asked you specifically about a 19-inch ballot image being imprinted on a 20-inch piece of paper. So are you changing your testimony now with respect to that?
No, I'm not. I don't know the exact measurements of a fit to paper printing. I know that it just creates a slightly smaller image of a 20-inch image on a 20-inch paper ballot.
Slightly smaller image. How come you didn't mention that yesterday?
I wasn't asked about that.
Well, I was asking you, is 19 inches smaller than 20 inches? It is, isn't it? Sure.
Yes.